they all have this thought that they don't really trust their banks, and they don't really trust their governments, and they don't trust the currency. And they're okay in their country for now, but they might need to leave their country. The idea here is that in the year 2024, the SEC approved the first digital commodity in the history of the world, Bitcoin, and fair value accounting became optional. And in January of 2025, this month, fair value accounting for that digital commodity became mandatory. And we expect in the first week of the Trump administration for SAB 121 to be repealed, and that means that every major bank in the world will be allowed to bank Bitcoin. So what you have is a status quo for 80 years where a corporation could have all of their assets in real estate, in gold, in soybeans, in oil, or in treasuries. But of course, the only thing that looks liquid and fungible is treasuries, and it doesn't beat the cost of capital. And now, Satoshi invents this new digital commodity. It takes 15 years for people to decide that it isn't tulip bulbs. It takes many years for the government to embrace it. And in the year 2025 is probably the first year where you could reasonably say the banks will probably handle it, the government's not going to ban it, and it really is a commodity. And so now, if you run a publicly traded company, you have a choice between Bitcoin or bonds. And the bonds are minus 10% real yield, and the Bitcoin is plus 45% real yield for the past 8 years. And you know, you might not be sure that you're going to keep getting plus 45% real yield, but I would submit to you that even if Bitcoin's returns collapse to the S&P index, and if you said it's just as good as the S&P, having a commodity that performs like the S&P is 10% better than using a bond. And so the real revolution in corporate finance for a CEO is you have the opportunity to recapitalize a company on a BTC standard instead of a USD standard. And what that means physically is you go from being negatively polarized to capital to being positively polarized to capital. Instead of being repulsive to capital, you're attractive. Wouldn't you like to walk into a meetings and be attractive instead of being repulsive when you walk in the meeting? If your capital is returning more than the S&P 500, you're creating shareholder value. How much capital can you gather? Like if I'm a hedge fund and I say I return consistently twice the S&P 500, how much do you want to invest in me? The answer is, how much money do you want? And if I go to you and I say I'm a hedge fund and I consistently underperform the S&P by 50%, how much capital do you want to invest in me? None. You're either magnetically attracting the capital or you're rejecting it. You said, okay, I got 100 rich families. They live in 47 countries. And they all have this thought that they don't really trust their banks, and they don't really trust their governments, and they don't trust the currency. And they're okay in their country for now, but they might need to leave their country sometime in the next 30 years. And so they come together and they think, where should we put our money? Okay, like the big idea is we want to keep our money. Okay, and so, you know, as I said, if God came down and said, I'll run the bank for you and I'm going to issue you God coin, there's going to be 21 million of them, and then you can telepathically move them between each other, and I will custody God coin for the next million years for free for you, then all these rich people would put their money in God's bank and they would use the God coin, and it would serve as a store of value for them because it's better than gold, it's better than diamonds, it's better than buying Picasso artworks, it's better than buying the local bonds, you know, in whatever local African country you live in, etc. But God hasn't chosen to do that. So the next best thing is maybe they decide to hire a computer programmer and they get some cypherpunk or some engineer and they say, can you actually program a digital bank that does the same thing? So it's not going to be God coin, it's going to be Bitcoin. And we want you to set it up so that we can buy, you know, so you've got 21 million of these units. And we're going to put our money in the Bitcoin bank, and that way we don't trust any other bank and any other government, and it's a network that we all join, a secure monetary network. One of them says, well, I don't think I trust you, and so none of the 100 families trust each other. And maybe even if they did, they don't trust their idiot grandsons that will come along in 60 years. So the question is, how do you actually create the Bitcoin network or the Bitcoin bank such that it is stable, it'll go on for hundreds of years when no one trusts anybody? What's the solution? And the answer is, we create a version of the software and we give it to everybody. And everybody on the network gets to run the software, and the software checks everybody else's software, and anybody that ends up lying gets kicked off the network. So every single family runs a version of the bank, and maybe every person in the family runs a version of the bank, and that's how we get to a decentralized network. Pretty soon, everybody with money on the network is running the software. Now, how do you secure it? Well, we need somehow to give it some anchor in the real world. So the software we run turns electricity into hashes, and the hashes are used to randomize the transactions on the network. And if you end up with billions and trillions and hundreds of quadrillions of hashes, pretty soon nobody knows who's going to build the next transaction block. But what you do know is that it's impossible for you to hack the thing with any sleight of hand.